The ninth season of Consider This is brought to you in part by From the Top, a national program showcasing the musical talents of young people. From the Top can be heard on KVNO Classical 90.7 each Sunday at 5 p.m.
Consider This, a program of issues and information behind today's news. Once again, from the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hi, and welcome back to Consider This and back to UNO. Speaking of UNO, our guest this week is a UNO graduate. She also has a law degree from Creighton University. Her name is Michaela Gilchrist, and this lovely lady is also a wonderful author. She came on the scene in 2001 with her first book, and that book was The Good Journey. The follow-up is about to come out. Actually, it's just come out, and it's called The Fiercer Heart. Now, Michaela, these stories found you. This is historical fiction, literary historical fiction. It's terrific. They find you?
I feel as though with regard to some projects, the books and the historical characters actually find the writer, and I certainly feel that that was true in my case.
Okay, now we're talking about we're talking about two generals of Civil War fame who'd also worked in the frontier and had some other things that they did. And they're pretty well known. They're not like the top ranking ones, but they were right up there in terms of history. And we know those names in Nebraska, do we not?
Oh, yes, you do, yes.
Your first book was about?
General Henry Atkinson, who was commander of the Western Frontier from up until, his death until 1841. So it would have been from about 1824 until 1841. And he was responsible for maintaining peace from the Red River almost all the way up to the Canadian border. And of course, Omahans are familiar with just the magnificent reconstruction at Fort Atkinson, and I spent a great deal of time there when I was researching the book. But well before that, when I was in college, I used to love to go. It's a beautiful park. That's just a beautiful area, and I'd take my son up there after he was born, and I'd walk him in the stroller, and we'd show him around. And so that's General Atkinson. General Philip Kearny is significantly younger. He was a Civil War Union commander and ultimately a division commander and a major general before his death during the Peninsula Campaign with the Civil War in Virginia.
But your story is about the women, the two primary women in their lives. Your first one is about Atkinson and the woman he married.
Mary Bullitt Atkinson.
And her sister is the subject. Her sister married Major General Kearny.
That's exactly right.
And so these two books, they're tied together by that, but they're wonderful stories in their own right.
They are just wonderful stories, and the sisters were magnificent subjects, because Mary Bullitt Atkinson was born in 1803 and Diana was born in 1820, so there's a 16-year age gap. But between the two women, if we look at their lives as the lens through which we view much of the 19th century, we have an inside, intimate look at what it was like to be a woman with as much power and clout as a woman could possibly have. But of course, that was through marriage and their unique view from their perches as the wives of very powerful generals. And so they watched the development of the American West and what happened in the 1840s and 1850s, and then the opening of the Civil War. They were just really terrific subjects, and I sort of felt as though I couldn't help but write these books.
These are strong women.
Incredibly strong women.
With incredible personal stories, and as love stories.
Yes.
They're amazing.
Yes.
But how did you stumble on the women, or did you stumble on the generals first?
I stumble over everybody. Actually, here in Omaha, it all started here in Omaha at the Jackson Street Booksellers. It was a rainy day, and I was home visiting my parents in 1997. I had just moved to Colorado, and I was so homesick for Omaha and homesick for my parents that I came back to see them. And I walked into the Jackson Street Booksellers, and they had a book on General Henry Atkinson, and I picked it up, and it was just a tattered old thing, and it fell open in my hands. And there was a footnote, and it was just a footnote, and it was the general's wife railing against his political opponents. And she said, The politicians who assail my husband are vile slanderers and midnight assassins who set forth lies then hide themselves in the dark. Mary Bullitt. And that was all I knew about her. And I read that, Carol, and I said, I have to know more about this woman because I like a woman who isn't afraid to rail a little now and again.
We all like to rail, yeah.
And so from there, I contacted the professor at Arizona State University who had written the book, and I said, tell me about Mary Bullitt, tell me about these women. And he said, well, I don't remember much about them. I wrote that book in 1963, he said, but I have letters here. I have all of their letters, and my secretary says if I don't clean out my office, she's going to quit. And so
did you book a flight?
I said he sent them to me. He sent them to me. And when they arrived at my home in Colorado, I still remember it was a beautiful spring day and the columbine was blooming, and I grabbed those letters and I ran home. It was my mailbox is a block and a half away from my house. I ran home as fast as I can and I began reading, and it was as if someone had sent me vivid snapshots of what it was like to be a woman in the 19th century. And these letters were so passionate and moving and detailed and witty and full of their sorrows and their losses and their achievements and their successes and their bonds as sisters. It was really just a wonderful discovery for me personally.
Were these their letters or the general's letters, or?
There was a little bit of a mix. It started, when I began, I had about, I'm going to guess there were about 150 of these letters written on foolscap, which is an enormous size of paper that they used before the Civil War, when paper became smaller and was.
War will do that to
War,
paper.
yes, war, ink and postage, and they were written in fine Spencerian script because they were well-educated women, and they were very proud of their handwriting. So I began reading these letters, and they mentioned all of these famous people. They mentioned Jefferson Davis, who was a little, shave-tail lieutenant at Jefferson Barracks, and they talked about Washington Irving came to see them, and they knew all of the entire pantheon of generals in the Civil War, and Franklin Pierce, who later became president. Just anybody who was anybody knew these two women and sought them out for the joy of their witty conversation, their glittering parties, and also for the political influence they could wield with their husbands and other men they knew at the War Department. And so once I found those names in those letters, I began doing research at various historical libraries around the country and reading those letters to give me a 360-degree view of what life may have been like for these women, because they in turn talked about the sisters, of course.
So this was rather time-consuming. Once you got the first parcel that set you into orbit, you did more, and I'm sure made a lot of phone calls and did a lot of checking. So that takes time. Then you have to codify it somehow and make some chronological. I mean, tell me the process. I've wanted to know how people fill in the gaps of history based on all these personal kinds of things.
Well, we'll use the Fiercer Heart as our template. But to begin with, I knew that General Philip Kearny. This is all I knew. General Philip Kearny, who was a legend, a military legend, and an adventurer who had won renown around the world. The French had awarded him the Cross of the Legion of Honor twice for what he had accomplished for the empire in Algeria and at the Battle of Solferino in 1859. I take that back. They awarded it to him, but he couldn't accept the first one.
He could not accept it, yes.
Okay. So I knew that about him, and I knew, everything I read was about him. And there were merely footnotes in the history books that I read that, he married the astonishing beauty Diana Bullitt in 1841, and then later divorced. And that was it.
Oh, there's so much more.
That was it. And so I started doing my detective work. But the other thing that helped immeasurably for me was having lived a little and having come from a family of Irish Catholic storytellers who taught me how to take a fact and spin it into something much bigger.
Well, I
don't know if that's a good thing or not.
And I know exactly. But we were able to embellish in a way that made people interested in hearing the kernel of it. Yeah, the truth of it. So you found all these things out, and then you had you had to write, like I said, fill in the gaps. You had to put the color on their face and their speech and their physical flourishes that they would have done because they were Southern, antebellum women. And how did you do that? Were you writing before that?
I've been writing my whole life. It's sort of a compulsion. I went to school here at UNO, and then of course to Creighton and got a law degree. But throughout my whole life, I'd been writing because I was writing down the stories that the women in my family. We all lived on Irish Hill in South Omaha, and I had something like 36 first cousins, 36 second cousins.
So you had a lot of fodder,
dozens
a lot of grist for the mill.
Yeah, yes. And so they'd sit around. The women would tell stories, and I'd go and write them down with disastrous effects sometimes, because then I'd read them and I'd be letting out, all the family secrets, like Dr. Hysterectomy who killed Madame Uterus, I mean.
Oh, you had a good imagination to boot.
But that was a skill. I think storytellers are slowly developed in the family environment. And for me, so I began with the kernel of these little bits of historical fact, and then it's my job to string them together sort of like pearls, or to be like a guide for the reader who enjoys traveling back in time to the 19th century. And I begin with the fact that here we have a trailhead and a guidepost, but what is the landscape going to look like? And that's where the part of being a writer comes in. I knew that Philip and Diana had had an explosively scandalous marriage, in a place, New York City, where in the 1840s they tolerated a great deal of hypocrisy and
New York's always been New York, is what you're saying, New York City.
That's a uniquely Nebraska, yes. But what is it like? What was it like for them when the doors were closed? What was it like behind that bedroom door? What did they say to one another? What quiet conversations did they have? And what sorts of things did they argue about? And that's where the writer's art comes in. And for that stuff, you learn that through living and falling in love and having your heart broken and listening to the women in your family.
I think that you mentioned something that a couple of things that people maybe pass up on the opportunity in their life, and I think I look back. I didn't have a big family like you, so I had a lot of things going on that I could write down. But I think we sometimes underestimate in this modern day and age where we've got the internet. We have words at our disposal, too many words in many cases, and we don't write down many of our own words and the words of people around us and their voices, hearing the voices of people. And I think when you write, and you tell me, you almost hear, having listened to the stories in your family, whatever, you hear the different voices, and you find the voice of your character, and you find your own voice as a writer. So you were really blessed, and you paid attention to what was around you.
I had good teachers. I learned everything about life sitting at those kitchen tables, in those houses in South Omaha, and listening to the stories about the love and loss and the things that they were proud of and the everyday moments. And that is, you're exactly right. That's how writers are formed, because by listening, it allows you. Then when the time comes to create and you set free all of those aspects of your imagination, those characters, Philip and Diana, sprang to life for me almost in whole cloth. I could hear General Kearney say, as clearly as your voice sounds to me now, it is a fact of natural history that a beautiful woman can destroy a man's life with very little effort, and I had not intended to write him into this book. It was going to be from Diana's point of view, but he insisted he be heard. And so.
Well, that's what writers say, that but the fact that I think oftentimes when we miss all those things now that we have with family, there is so little family interaction and so little of really knowing the characters of your family. I mean, every family has characters. There's the quiet characters, there's the loud characters, there's the desperate characters, and those are where you start to be able to hear things in your head, so when you walk away, you're still hearing.
Yes.
And it's almost a skill. All the writers I know say that that's the most important thing, is being able to hear not only a voice, but then the character comes out.
Yes.
And then, but the voice has to be there.
Yes.
So tell me about Diana in your new book, Fierce or Heart, Diana Bullitt. Her circumstances it's pretty dire when she finally is proposed to her by the good Major General, and it is so up and down. I mean, you couldn't write this stuff if you wanted to make up stories. This is, as you said, explosive.
As I said earlier, I knew only that there had been a marriage and a divorce. And so for me, the part that was my creation and my art was, trying to understand what would have torn this marriage apart, because Diana had no incentive whatsoever to divorce one of the richest, most powerful men in the United States, given a number of factors. Let's look at the economic ones first. Divorce in 1857 in New York City meant economic death. There was no tracking mechanism for following an errant husband and getting alimony payments or support payments for children. In 1857 in New York City, there were two divorces registered with the clerk of the Supreme Court. There are documents in the book that I obtained from Norman Goodman. And so when a man and a woman divorced in New York City, what it meant was that not only did it become the stuff of tabloid scandal, and in fact, pamphleteers would print up and illustrate everything the woman had said in court that day, along with commentary from everyone who had crammed into the courtroom.
So if you think it's sensationalistic now.
Yeah. It also meant social death for Diana. So even though she was the innocent party, in that the only thing she had done was to devote herself to her family and try to raise her children, once she decided to part from Philip, she was ostracized by everyone she knew, was not received in the houses that had welcomed her before. People would cross the street to avoid her, and she knew she had to seek a new life for herself. For her, it meant forced exile, not only from New York, but she soon found that her children were so viciously tormented in the United States because they were stigmatized as the children of... To be divorced was horrifically unacceptable. And she felt she had to leave the United States, and she took them to France just so that they might have an opportunity to have some sort of life.
But you've put all the things in between. You say you find out these bare facts, and actually the facts is that there was another woman.
Yes.
And not just kind of any old woman, a woman from across the pond.
Actually, Agnes Maxwell, who was 19 years younger than Philip Kearny when he met her. And what he did was socially beyond the pale. He seduced the daughter of a prominent family. It was completely acceptable for a man
to have a little philandering.
To go to a brothel in New York City. There were so many brothels in New York City that at one point the social agencies, which had been founded by the various churches in New York, estimated that there were something like 20,000 girls working as prostitutes in a population. It would have been about 20% of the population. I mean, it was just an outrageous number. There weren't a lot of jobs. You were either a maid.
Yeah.
Seducing a maid was fine, but you never seduced the daughter of a prominent family, and that's it was mutual. She wasn't a victim, but it was. It
had a lot
rocked.
to work with here. Not a lot in terms of facts, but some pretty interesting.
Well,
we
had that fact, but now this is what was interesting to me. I wanted to understand. I asked myself the questions. What's the difference between being me and being her? What's the difference between living now and living then? And what would have driven a wedge into this marriage and forced this woman out of it? And all of the literature written about Kearny describe him in really two-dimensional terms. They describe him as, the bravest of the brave. He was never afraid, even when he lost his arm in the U.S.-Mexican War, and it was subsequently it was shot off by grape shot and then was subsequently amputated. So I asked myself, what caused the disintegration of this marriage. And it was not only the long absences, I think, but also probably post-traumatic stress disorder, even though they certainly didn't recognize that at the time. And then, you know, I had to fashion a whole life for Diana in the cities where she lived by looking at the details of everyday life and trying to understand what it meant to dress the way she dressed, what her schedule, what it meant to live by her schedule. And let me, if I may, in Washington, when they lived in Washington on between 13th and 14th Street on K Street, Carney was aide-de-camp to General Winfield Scott, and Winfield Scott asked Carney to assume all of his party hosting duties. Carney said, "I don't want to do this. You do this, Diana." And so Diana assumed that responsibility. And I looked at the lives of Washington hostesses at the time, and it became apparent to me that if she was entertaining at the level that the evidence sort of shows that she would have been hosting 150 people in her home a week, and in essence running a small restaurant, a household staff of 15, corresponding with 75 to 100 people a week at just a routine.
Yes.
And in her spare time, she gave birth to 5 children in 8 years and homeschooled them. So she was a busy girl.
So the interesting thing is, you obviously, how much of this is inspiration, how much is perspiration? Because when you get that first, you know, parcel of things that got you started on this whole bullet sister journey, you have obviously had to study minute details or grasp onto anything so that you could not only make it historically correct, but, you know, to paint the picture for yourself so that you could in turn tell the story, say the words. That's a lot of work.
And I like what you just said there, because that's very much it. In other words, the details inspire a lot of the scenes. So while I had a series of just facts, to breathe life into that required equal parts, you know, just a lot of long hours staring at the computer.
Well, you would have to look at the fashions of the time.
Yes.
I mean, and when you describe, I just picked one page and I looked. You have a description of a painting. You have a description of her of the items of clothing. You have to be historically accurate.
People will catch
because
me.
people. There are some people that just sit out there and look at those things, but you need all that as to paint the picture for yourself before you can paint it for anybody else. And I just found it fascinating because I know that you know, Simon & Schuster doesn't pick up a writer who A, cannot write, or B, cannot get it right. And so that way I was intrigued to read your first book in the first place, because that was quite a thing. I mean, you may be great and famous, but you know, the first book is always the hardest to...
The first book is the hardest.
And you worked for, what, 4 years on that?
I think the first one, I think, took 2.5. This one took 3. This one took 3. And with regard to the inspiration stuff we've been talking about, I find too that reading the poets and listening to music and long walks in the mountains in Colorado are greatly helpful, along with the things that my friends and family and my husband and child say. They know, in fact, they'll come up to me and say, "I inspired that, that's my line. I know that happened." You know, so I steal shamelessly from them.
So you do what an actor does in a sense, because you're or a playwright, let's say. You're creating the characters with the voices, and you have to live, eat, and breathe them.
That's very true. You know, we find, in fact, the delusion takes over the entire family. And when doors slam unaccountably or because of the wind or something, my husband will say, "Oh, that's Mary," or that's General, you know, Carney. He's furious up there, Mom, or, you know, you better get back up there and work. But that's true. And I find that I become so wholly absorbed in the world that I'm writing about that sometimes the phone rings and, you know, it's more than startling. You know, it's.
And sometimes you don't even want to go to that world.
No.
Because you have to write as it comes to you.
Yes, it's you know, we talk about language immersion for foreign students at UNO. Well, I do the same thing when I'm writing about this period of history. I try to avoid, you know, listening to a lot of television because you tend to pick up inadvertently TV voice.
Not only
Yes.
that, there are little phrases. You have to go back and see if this phrase existed in
Yes.
that time.
Yes.
And there are ways to do that, but then it can take hours just to verify one thing, or then to find out you have to throw it out. Why did you decide, you know, you're a college-trained lady with a law degree. Why did you decide, or what told you said, I'm going to go at this full time?
Well, I was an awful lawyer, but I loved writing stories. I was probably the worst lawyer in Omaha. I loved writing stories, and I've been doing it my whole life. And actually, I was working for an Omaha company, and I loved it. I loved the people there. I loved my job. But I got those letters. I obtained those letters, and I still remember. I knew I had to try it. And I said to my husband, I'll make a deal with you. Give me 6 months. I am so glad I didn't know anything about the publishing industry or writing. I said, give me 6 months. I'm going to try to sell this book. I'm going to write 60 pages, and we'll see if anyone picks it up. And if they don't, I will go back to being, you know, working in a corporate environment. And, you know, and he was like, oi, you know, we have a mortgage. You can't just quit. But he gave me that opportunity, and Michael Korda at Simon & Schuster bought the first novel within 24 hours of having read the manuscript. And so it happened. I never tell young writers that story because
they would get so demoralized.
Yes,
it's normally a pretty long process.
It's a very tough competitive business.
We have only a minute left.
Okay.
Who's in the next book?
I would really like to write a contemporary series, and I'm really turning a keen eye on my family, which is making them nervous.
I'm going to hear about that uterus again. I want to thank you. I do want to pump this book again. It is fantastic.
Oh, thank
Try
you,
to
Carol.
get, you can get the first one in paperback, I
Yes,
believe now, the
it's in
Good
paper.
Journey, or you can get it at your library if you can't afford it or can't find it. And The Fiercer Heart is now out, and you'll want to catch it. The Omaha Public Library has a few on order, and you can buy as many as you want here. Thank you so much, Michaela Gilchrist,
you,
for being with us.
Carol.
Come back next time, and we'll hear all
I'd
about
love
your new
to.
book.
All right. Thank you so much.
Have a good one. We'll see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television. More information and program archives can be found at unotv.unomaha.edu. If you'd like to share your comments about this show, call UNO TV at 402-554-2516 during regular business hours.
The 9th season of Consider This is brought to you in part by From the Top, a national program showcasing the musical talents of young people. From the Top can be heard on KVNO Classical 90.7 each Sunday at 5 p.m.